Okay, welcome to day 2 of the 4th installment of Reading Zoos in the Age of the Anthropocene. We have 3 speakers lined up, or presenters lined up this afternoon, morning, and evening, depending on where you are. And the first is Anne Hölck, and I'm going to give the floor to her.
Yeah, hi. Good morning, evening, whatever. Well, I'll start my presentation about the copper engraving showing a female fetus of a hippopotamus from a famous book you might all know. And I wrote my English text down, so I start to read to you. I only recently came across this copper engraving showing a female fetus of a hippopotamus on a dissection table. It was published in 1764 in volume 12 of the Histoire générale du nature by the natural scientist Georges-Louis Leclerc Comte de Buffon. And actually, I used it in a very broadly context of a lecture on museology to illustrate a shift in exhibiting animals' bodies from the Wunderkammern through the Naturalienkabinette, the cabinets of natural objects, where animals or part of them were collected all together in one space, to the shift to the separated presentation of one species, and to make visible junctions or interfaces in the establishment of zoos and museums in Europe in the end of the 18th, beginning of 19th century, related to the space in which animal bodies were exhibited. I'll give you a short introduction to the image and its publication that probably a lot of you know, and will try to explain what struck me after I used this image for the lecture, looking again closer. And I brought this image because I'm very curious what your starting point of a story about this image would be. Out of your research field, I already got some new tracks looking at this image through your contributions and the keynote yesterday. Thanks so much for this. And I just switched to the other image I brought in text shortly. So you remember from the workshop reader. After our discussion, or if it fits in between, I will comment on the text by Hannah Antelfinger coming from their artwork called 5 Conversations with Taxidermized Animals. It's my second finding I put in the workshop reader as it relates for me to open up approaches of storytelling on animal bodies. And Ute Hörner, one of the artists, was there yesterday in the workshop, but unfortunately she cannot join us today due to her academy session. The female hippopotamus fetus was part of the cabinet collection of the French King Louis XV that natural scientist Buffon took care of in his position as director of the Royal Jardin des Plantes, with its botanic garden, paleontological and anatomical collections and laboratories. Buffon was significantly involved in the planning of the Ménagerie du Jardin des Plantes for living animals, but died 1788 before the zoo's foundation a few years later in 1793 as part of the Musée National d'Histoire Naturelle, also founded in this year. Sarah showed the plans yesterday. Since 1749, Buffon published the Histoire naturelle générale et particulière that provided a framework with which new observations could be compared, creating a stimulus look for the so-called new species that would mean unknown species for European scientists and members of the bourgeoisie who could buy these popular books. Just the skins or fetus like this were known at that time in Europe, not a living animal. Buffon intended to give a full descriptions of all known animals, but many of them never saw himself. He added a lot of skeleton illustrations from the anatomy collection and used all documents and travel reports available as sources at that time. The encyclopedic collection of 36 large volumes were continued after his death by his fellow scientists until 1804. Till then and after, widely spread over Europe in translations in English, German, Swedish, Russian, Italian, also Dutch. This book was a standard knowledge provider about animals for a long time, although criticized by academics for its popular language. The Histoire naturelle is bibliographically very complex due to the plenty formats, editions, translations, and abridgments, not only in the translations, but also in the original. I refer to the translation in German from 1767 of part 6, volume 2, published in Leipzig, where the image of the hippopotamus fetus was attached close to the text about it. Buffon wrote about it. The first passage I will read to you in my translation in English. Buffon writes, description of hippopotamus. We did not see a hippopotamus in its full size. This description was made from a fetus and pulped heads of hippopotamus that are part of the cabinet of the king. Furthermore, it involves the foot bones that Bernard de Jussieu informed us about. This fetus is presented on the third copper plate, how it lies on a table next to anatomical instruments that will serve for its dissection. Through a window, one perceives a large hippopotamus, which is a copy of the figure Fabius Columna made for this animal. This hippopotamus stands at the shore of the Senegal River that is shown through a baobab. In the first footnote, Buffon is referring to the sketch of a hippopotamus by the Italian botanist Fabio Colonna, published in his book Ekphrasis in 1606. The sketch is presumed to be made after the description of the Dr. Federico Serenghi from 1603, who describes in his travel reports 2 hippopotami that he apparently captured in Egypt and brought their skins to Italy. In Buffon's longer text called About the Hippopotamus, that is prefixed to the description of the fetus, Serenghi's description from about 150 years earlier is his main reference to the appearance of a fully grown hippopotamus. In the second footnote, he refers to the presumed natural surrounding at the Senegal River with the baobab and to a description of the baobab. So there's already a long story to the background of this copper plate. The fetus The fetus provenance is, from what I found so far, unknown, not reported in the text by Buffon, except that it was kept in alcohol in the king's collection and its body is now fragmented. On the following pages, after the intro I was reading to you, Buffon is describing meticulously all inside parts of this animal body, also that it is female. This setup in which the fetus is presented is presumably a quite realistic representation of the anatomic laboratory, as Buffon even explains in the related text. It is the moment before the dissection. Scalpel, scissors lie ready to cut. a bowl and a towel to hold the body parts, and a big glass in the back, probably filled with liquid to balm these parts. In my lecture on museology, I would describe, with the help of this image, the human gaze on animals as objects, the close connection to scientific interests on anatomy of that time, with the related practice of collecting animal bodies, dead or alive, for dissection, out of which especially the zoo in Paris, the Ménagerie du Jardin des Plantes, developed. Until today, the so-called living collection of animals is part of the Musée National d'Histoire Naturelle. What struck me then after my lecture, looking at the image again closer, is that I felt somehow captured by my own human gaze. I mean the way I used the image, seeing everywhere zoo enclosures and their origins from a distance. Should one begin with the gaze of the drawn animal that looks somehow alive as if it was just born, or with a scalpel ready to cut the body, somehow getting more inside this setting and closer to the animal's body? I was already inspired by the workshop reader and the contributions yesterday by Gail, Marcela, Thera, Niharika, and the keynote of Louise, in trying to find out other perspectives on or of animal bodies, to start also this story about the hippopotamus fetus differently. This is why I brought this image, actually. Gather more than just one story. So I'm very curious to hear some now, or what struck you, or if it struck you. I'll stop the... I don't know if you like to look at the picture while we're speaking.
This isn't a question, just a comment, one of those, but I was really struck by the little bench under the table. And there are so many things that are clamoring for one's attention in this image. But thinking about what you just said about being made to think of your own gaze as part of this picture. I mean, I think it's a bench, that little seat that looks like one is about to pull it out and sit down and commence.
Yes, I didn't mention it because I thought because my gaze now is totally fragmented on all other objects and connected to the fetus. Yeah, I think it's a quite realistic setup of a laboratory at that time. It must be because in the text also that is following, Buffon is describing really in detail how the cutting is proceeded.
It has one of those framing devices of someone is about to enter the room and commence the dissection, which I think you mentioned. It's like, I think, as you're saying, it looks like someone's going to come in, pull out the bench and sit down and start cutting. So it's kind of a story image, I suppose, in that sense. And, you know, that nearness of the human presence is implied through the bench, perhaps. I was quite intrigued by the little foot. I mean, I might be reading it wrongly, but one of the rear feet almost looks like it's deformed or turned, and whether that's a kind of detail of the fetus. And does that sort of play to the texts that you included as well, in the sense of a kind of wrong birth, or a sense of why the fetus has died?
Sorry, I didn't get it.
I just wondered whether the foot was deformed, really. Did you think that the rear foot looked deformed, turned around?
It was the fetus was kept. He mentioned this in alcohol. So, and actually he points on it. shrinked. The whole body shrinked in the alcohol. He mentions this. Shall I put up the picture again? Maybe. Shall Johanna?
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. I was wondering whether we could use Foucault's The Order of Things as a reference text in order to look at that image. And it just, I have just some associations, but does it somehow for before represent a certain progress of science in studying animals? For example, could this image in the background kind of represent an old way of examining animals back from the times what Foucault called die Episteme der Ähnlichkeit, the episteme of similarities, and then the dissection, like the real anatomic dissection of this hippopotamus, something that at that time is more progressive, scientifically speaking, because what they now do is like they, oh gosh, I'm sorry, my English is just, what they now have is an actual animal that can, you know, be examined, like the physical presence of an actual animal, like an anatomic based research. And then we could, like this kind of science, we could classify with Foucault as based in the episteme der Klassik, the classical episteme. So, like, can we somehow see this image as a representation of the change from the former episteme to the current, to the contemporary episteme, which is the classic episteme? I don't know whether it was coherent what I tried to explain, but it just somehow came to my mind to read this picture with Foucault.
I also thought, yeah, I think my confusion was if we, or also, actually, I have many questions to you. Cannot answer all questions. I was thinking of if we can we, or maybe can we get something contemporary out of it, and not only putting it back in this time. This was my my thinking. If we can, or will we always use it as an historical plate, put it back in the epistemics of the historical epistemics? Can we actually find a way of a connection, unexpected connection? Like I was so inspired also by big words like of Marcella, proximity and distance, unexpected connections of Gail was mentioning. Maybe this picture, this image is only a practice, you know, like practicing to get more inside of concept of zoos. Do you know what I mean?
Can I just jump in and say that I found the image really, really moving, and quite a disturbing image. Can you hear me okay, Anne?
Yes.
And it made me think of a maternal gaze, and it reminded me of an experience I had when my children were babies, and I'd spoken to other women about this too, that there was this strange kind of experience where when you had a very small baby that, I remember seeing a rat turn up, in the house. It's on the veranda, and I was like, oh, it's a rat. But instead of seeing a rat, I projected onto the rat that it was my baby. And it's like, the whole relationship with the animal was like, like this is a bit of vermin I'm supposed to kind of respond to. But I had this just like really strange sudden kind of reaction that I could not, in the face of the animal, I could only see the face of my baby, like my baby. And I remember talking to someone else about this, and she said, oh yeah, that even happened to me with a squash toad. And I'm like, wow, really? So that kind of image of the face and the animal face, and it made me think about how baby face is a big thing at the zoo now, as a kind of emotional connection. And so I think, that it's very interesting, that kind of tension between the scientific image and the kind of, the tender gaze that to a certain extent was definitely evoked by the text that you included. So I think that for me, it was a very tender image, despite the kind of other macabre, I would say, or kind of, the fate of the animal is also presaged by the instruments, as you said.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, yeah, for me too. It was. I was very struck and disturbed. I think this is the better word. And also the connection that it is, that I talked about in one sentence only, but it somehow looks alive, and there was this connection with me to the sudden birth, but then the blood is missing, or we can't see it on an engraving, but it's not messy. This table is not messy. Maybe it's that also the connection to Foucault, and but also to the keynote yesterday. I made a connection. Shall I? Actually, I don't know how the hands got up in which order. I'll do it messy. Mia.
I think actually Marcella was first, and then it was Andrew, and then maybe me, and then Christina. That helps.
Okay. Great, thank you. Marcela?
Yes, thanks. Do you hear me?
Yes.
I thought about your question about seeing this image from, like, if we can look at it also as an example, or if we can see something contemporary in it. And maybe that would be, I don't know what kind of project do you have where you're going to use this image, but also thinking about yesterday's keynote where Louise talked about configurations, and we talked about Avi Warburg's atlas. Maybe you could look at other images, more contemporary or more more present.
In a more contemporary way, you mean?
No, I mean that maybe if we see this image isolated, we have one kind of experience, but if we see it along other images, maybe more contemporary, maybe, I don't know, an image you can get from Instagram or from a present laboratory, or I don't know.
And like you also mentioned the Abby book.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
To use it in
So
a-
maybe this can frame this image in another way so that we can look at the connections that present experiences of laboratory experimentation, for example, or zoo experiences, or I don't know, maybe some other unexpected connections with other images that don't have to do with, concretely with experimentation, or but
that are visual.
yeah.
And yeah, I don't have a project yet. My project was to bring it.
Mhm.
But I don't know.
Yeah, it's a very powerful image. I mean, I was really struck by it, really impressed. It's really disturbing. And the hippo on the background and the baobab, it's all really, yeah, it's very impressive. And it works by itself, but
yeah, and
maybe
there is a small idea in my back to gather the stories from different perspectives, like yours, somehow also. So this is the first try out. Thank you for all the comments. And Matthew, I think Mia, you said it was Matthew.
Andrew,
Oh,
I think.
I think it's me.
Sorry.
Hi. Thanks, guys. Thank you, Anna. Yeah, there's lots going through my head. I'll try to limit myself. I think I would just update what Gail had to say, though, just off the top, that I don't know, I had a very similar reaction to this. My son walked in as this image popped up, actually, after he woke up, and he was very struck by it, by the image, and didn't quite know what was happening. I would just update what Gail said to make it the parental gaze, because I feel very similarly when I see there's so much animal that goes through my mind as I'm raising a son, a child, and so much of that it's so contemporary for me. It's everywhere. Whenever I see, we had a little baby squirrel adopt us for 2 weeks in the backyard, and it was impossible not to see my son somehow in this animal, and to see his sort of the acrobatics he would do on our back patio, in the same way that my son, is still testing out his motor, everything. So I just wanted to add that on top of what Gail had to say, because I think I'm also experiencing that all the time. And I guess the juxtapositions in this image are continuing to leap out at me as I'm looking at it. The two that strike me the most are my visceral reaction when I see this, obviously, is horror and disgust, and then another reaction comes through. And it's kind of amazing to me that in an image that is so potentially horrific, I'm still so struck by how delightful this baby creature is, and I'm struck by its features. And I see its little front legs, and I think last night I had my cat on my lap and I was petting his front feet, which cats hate, but he'll let me do it. And I was wondering what he was thinking and feeling. And so this image also took me to a moment of real delight with a domestic animal. Should I allow myself to just sort of not take in the umbilical cord, not take in the scalpel and the scissors? So and that was unstoppable too. Like I had an unstoppable moment of reaction to the horror, but also to just how delightful this creature would have been. And that's still there for me in this image. You know, it moves back and forth from my foreground to my background, I guess, as I'm looking at it. The other thing that strikes me, when I was doing some writing a long time ago about chimpanzees and sort of looking at how the Western relationship with the chimp began, obviously I got into Nicholas Tulp and his Book of Monsters and the first engraving of the first chimpanzee to make it to Western shores. It came from Angola. That famous image of this chimp, now we're pretty sure it was a bonobo, that was given to the Prince of Orange as a gift. And that chimp, that bonobo died quite quickly after coming to shore. And then Edward Tyson, the British anatomist, did the first dissection of a great ape. And this revolutionized anatomy, and it obviously struck everyone how similar everything was inside the body. And I guess what I see here is some kind of shift away from, or I would imagine those dissecting this animal, once whoever comes in and pulls out that bench, sits down and starts doing it, is doing so for to learn something. And I wonder if that's something that could make this a bit more contemporary, because we still do this all the time, not on baby hippos, but we engage in invasive research on animals all the time to learn something. And so this is deeply connected to what happens in laboratories now around the world. And my brain is really slow, so there was so many more things I had on that, but I'll just leave it there. Those are kind of my two reactions to it.
Thank you. Great to listen to such a flowing story about it, with many aspects I also had. I couldn't describe actually, and the contemporary dissection or practice of dissection is, we also, I think, will hear. I've read in the poem we will hear something about later, of the giraffe. A quite actual, yeah, you all read it, so you know what I mean. Excuse my English, by the way. Just slowly to speak for me. And I think then Mia and Christina.
Yeah, I think that my point follows from this. I also have two children, but I have kind of the opposite reaction, actually, in the sense to me that one of the, while looking at this image, it's striking to me and also a bit disturbing how much domestication is related to sympathy or empathy, and thus also to a sense of personhood, I guess. And to me, that might be a contemporary connection to make, in the sense that we see this hippopotamus fetus, and it's inside, of course, and it's in an interior space, and you see like the wild hippopotamus through the window. So there's a real contrast between domestication and wildness there. And then there's this this sort of use of the babiness of it, or the fetal nature of it, to be like it's domesticated, and also thus calls for more kind of tenderness or sympathy. And thus perhaps we see it closer to being like a different kind of being or species that we might feel empathy with. To me is striking, but also a bit disturbing. And I guess the reason why I bring this up is I've been, I also write poetry, and I've been working on a series of poems about Rachel Rausch, who's the daughter of Friedrich Rausch, who's a botanist, a Dutch botanist, who did a lot of preservations of human fetuses, and also with the help of Rachel, would oftentimes create sort of collages or montages with human fetuses. So would add ribbon or lace, or add a shell and tie a shell around the head of the fetus and so forth. And the reason why I've been quite interested in this, because I've been thinking a lot about the issues of reproductive justice that are coming up in the United States. And when we define a fetus as being a person versus not, And to me, the discourse about whether or not a fetus is a person, whether a fetus is a living, independent being, is kind of besides the point in some ways, because you know, obviously, if you're a woman and you decide to have an abortion, then obviously that is something that is a choice that a woman makes, and obviously one related to her body. On the other hand, to then say, well, a fetus is not a person, also, of course, doesn't do justice to perhaps the people who had miscarriages and feel the necessity of granting personhood to in their process of mourning. And so this sort of like concrete division between what makes something a fetus versus what makes something an actual hippopotamus, what makes something a fetus versus an actual human being or person, is a really complicated and interesting line, I think, that's being discussed right now. And I wondered if that might be a sort of contemporary link also to think about the discussions about reproductive justice, especially with humans, and when something is a fetus versus a person, when something is a fetus versus a hippopotamus, in this case, that might be a link that could be made.
Yeah, and the question of caring. Also, I was thinking of this too. Thank you. I think now it's Christina.
Yeah.
Pauw.
Thank you for this great image. So I have so many associations. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. I thought about the paintings by Jean-Baptiste Audry, who painted the animals of the menagerie of Versailles as well. He painted this really big rhino. And what Audry did was that he observed the behavior of the animals, and all his animals had strange feet. And what was special about his animals was that they had an expression in the eyes, but also in gesture. And this hippo, it looks somehow dead, but at the same time it's alive, and it makes a kind of gesture towards the observer. So it has this reaching hand of its front paw, if you can call it that way. And his eye is dead, but it's not completely empty. So there's one point which that it has a kind of gaze, I think. So it doesn't have, the eye doesn't look alive anymore, but it's not completely empty. And I think that's very interesting because the eye is in the center of the image, and it directs towards the observer of this image. And this is a technique to create some empathy, which Audry did as well with his paintings. And what I find really fascinating is that you can see this authentic, I would call it, animal of the dissection in front of the scientist, of Buffon. But then he looks out of the window, or he looks on a painting. You don't know that from the imprint. And on this painting, or in the window, you can see kind of the imaginary landscape of the baobab and kind of typology of African landscape or whatever. And this reminds me of the diorama of the zoo. So you have, if you want to bring it in the presence, so you have an animal in the zoo, which is kind of representation of the animal in a kind of imaginary landscape. And this imaginary landscape is presented in the diorama by typical trees and maybe by the imagination of a wild animal. So the grown-up hippo, I think he didn't know how it looked like because it looks like a bear or something, but not like a hippo. So the only image he has is this baby hippo. And then there's a kind of fantasy thing, which is a kind of ekphrasis of the real world also. So there are many things, many connections came to my mind, but that would be the point. So thank you for bringing that in, Anna.
Yeah, I mentioned this also. And the most information is about this background image, because it is supposed that the sketch I showed, it's, well, there's also more like, if you go for the drawings of hippopotamus at that time, they all came from the Zengi skins. Well, this is another whole story one can follow, how this drawing developed. And also the diorama mentioning, maybe it's also good that Pauw is now commenting, because he will give us in his talk an insight of dioramas.
Yeah, thank you. But I was also, because
Giving over, I did talk a lot. And
no, that's okay, because it's an interesting image and there's a lot to say about it, because it also set my mind to work immediately that sort of this weird, like we talked about, sort of the dichotomy between sort of the parental gaze, but then also this specimen almost. And I was also, because Leclerc, like he hadn't been, did he go to Africa or?
No.
No, so I was also sort of because I suppose this fetus was sort of on his own table, but then he does look out sort of on an African typography, and he was just said. But I was also sort of struck by sort of that idea of a changing habitat. Also made me think of I think in around 1990 or something, Pablo Escobar had this zoo, and when he was shot, I think sort of the hippos broke free from the zoo, and they're still thriving there, and there were efforts made to cull the population, but apparently the local populations or the local people were so enamored with these hippos that they sort of revolted against the idea that they would be slaughtered. So there's also this weird thing of the hippo as almost as a mascot or something that is, well, maybe not cute, but also this weird tension between a hippo, which is actually quite a dangerous animal, but it also being something that belongs to the people, or I don't know, and also because the hippos there are also in a different environment, which is also something that this engraving emphasizes, sort of with the the landscape, which could not really have been there in a sense. So I don't know.
Yeah, it's a. I think also the landscape is taken out of parts. So the ground is not fitting to the. There is a palm, there is a baobab, and that's actually all. It's all. The rest is taken. The baobab is a sketch is made from a. I think it was in a sketchbook, and there is a long description. So it's all made by descriptions except the fetus and the instrument in this image.
Yeah. That's also really like a recreation of a recreation sense. Like
yeah, I was thinking also on our recreation of these kind of findings, like this image. They did it the same, in the same way before. Took the descriptions of 150 years before to describe, and well, he would compare the sources and try to find the truth description.
Yeah, that makes it even weirder. It's yeah.
Of all of the surrounding of the body, and except the description of the features.
It's. I'm just looking at the time here briefly. I think since we have 3 speakers in this session, I didn't want to interrupt Pauw since it's his own time that he's eating into here. But I think thank you, Anna, for this very fascinating image, which I think, as we can tell, has given everybody a lot to think about. But I would say that we move on now to the diorama and to taxidermy and photography, which Pauw is going to tell us about.
Thank you very much. And yeah, I'd love to do this project with you. Thank you. And I sent you the Hörner Antelfinger link in the chat.
Pauw, we can't see or hear you.
Oh, sorry. It's okay. At least you can hear me now, and you should. No. Yeah, there I am. Can you all see the presentation? Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So yeah, hi everyone. So several years back, in 2016 to be precise, the Nederlands Fotomuseum, or Dutch Photography Museum, in Rotterdam held an exhibition called Jacht met de Camera, or Hunt with the Camera, about early Dutch nature photography, so from around 1890 till 1930. And as a volunteer at the museum at the time, I'd helped with the scanning and digitally optimizing of the glass plate negatives that were made by several of these early nature photographers. And as I moved on from being a volunteer, these photos stayed with me. And last year, when sort of the opportunity arose, I decided to finally further investigate what it was exactly that kept drawing me to them. And one of the first things I noticed was that, contrary to what I read so far about the Anglo-American discourse on wildlife and animal photography, was that these early Dutch photographs seemed to stem from a different cultural modality, one which leaned more towards sort of the protection and welfare of local animals, and also the use of photography in that process, as opposed to the use of photography sort of exotic animals in economies of display and status, as we saw, for instance, yesterday with the elephants, but also sort of the photographic animal trophies as evidence of a American nationalism, for instance. And this is not to say that hunting and the disturbance of animal lives did not occur alongside photography, because this did unfortunately still happen, but rather that the photos, their mode of production, and also their use, in some ways seem to gesture towards a human-animal relation that emphasizes a reality where the animal is also perceived to exist beyond the photo. And the photos or that I've included in the reader were all taken by Paul Louis Steenhuisen, somewhere between 1891 and 1919. And they show a variety of dioramas. And here you can see on the right side, you can see Paul Louis Steenhuisen in his workshop, working on, I think, a chimpanzee, or the frame for one. And on the left, you can see a photograph he took, which is coincidentally also the first Dutch photo of a living bird. I think it's a great woodpecker, and you can just about see him sitting against a tree. And in the background is Steenhuisen's workshop, so where he did his taxidermy. And as such, there is sort of this weird and interesting overlap between taxidermy on the one hand and photography on the other. Steenhuisen often used his own photos as reference material, and also sort of collected his own specimens, which means he hunted them or got them from other hunters. And these dioramas were consequently made for and displayed in Artis Zoo, which adds yet another layer to this sort of complex animal representation. photography and taxidermy also share numerous characteristics with each other. So Kitty Hauser, for instance, states that they both stem from a desire to possess and control the natural world, and that they attempt to sort of freeze life in an ultimately doomed attempt to outwit time. And while it is, of course, important to sort of remember these aspects when discussing photography and taxidermy, I also wonder how or if it was possible to sort of see instances from this time, taxidermy and photography, sort of beyond or alongside this desire to control the natural world. So where the animal is not portrayed as either an extension of or an exclusion from the human, but rather as that we're sort of living beside each other. So sort of a multi-species world in a sense. And one of the ways in which I tried to sort of envision how this might be possible was by focusing more on the affective and tactile dimensions of the photograph and the diorama, and how this can sort of show how Steenhuisen also worked from a desire for a closer contact with another species, and how we sort of managed to convey this to the viewer. For this, I mainly looked at what anthropologist Petra Tjitske-Kalshoven has described as techniques of contiguity. These are sort of embodied expressions of a desire for proximity with the rare and elusive. And these techniques are often performed by both the piecing together and an acting out of a specific animal story and its material recreation. So if we look at the photograph of the St. Martin's diorama, this also serves as a good example for that. So here we have it. Whereas habitat dioramas usually sort of aim to create a total environment and also to convince their viewers of its supposed authenticity, the diorama by Steenhuisen sort of seems to, or this illusion seems to slowly fall apart if we look at the the techniques of contiguity, because sort of while the birds still manage to convey a sense of organic authenticity, in that they look how they're supposed to look, the environment sort of forces the viewer to look haptically and also feel the depth materiality of the birds. So if you look below the St. Martin's, you can sort of see this rough, static slab of concrete almost, which is supposed to convey the sense of a sandy cliff. But if you look closely, you can almost sort of start to identify the handprints of Steenhuisen as he sort of was sculpting this cliff. And it's sort of in this static hapticity that it guides your eyes towards the St. Martin's, and it sort of emphasizes a tactile and kinesthetic way of seeing the material that Steenhuisen used to recreate the bird's natural habitat. So it sort of frames how we look at the diorama. And while such a focus might negate the natural authenticity that Steenhuisen was aiming for, it does help in the creation of a relationality between sort of viewer, Steenhuisen, and the St. Martin's in a sense. And if we look on the level of the photograph furthermore, we can also see this material artificiality reflected in an extreme alteration of the image. Because if you look closely, sort of all the sections that are white have been plastered over with a sort of a layer of cover paint, which was usually used to isolate the object of the photograph and sort of be able to show it in a different context. And yeah, you can almost, it seems to sort of echo the coarseness of the cliffside, and sort of you can almost also imagine Steenhuisen slowly applying the paint on his glass negative. Yeah, and as such, sort of, this can help us become aware of the layered construction of the animal and its habitat. And as such, it can also sort of shape the viewer's perceptions and imaginings of environments past and future, to sort of how we can recreate these spaces. And what we are looking at here then is not correctness or supposed organicity, but rather its frayed edges. So sort of the messiness that we had yesterday with Louise's keynote. And it sort of opens us up. It invites us to be aware of other, perhaps unintended effects and meanings. Also, as we just had with the engraving. And sort of this allows us to see this not so much as a transparent window onto nature, but rather as sort of a way of feeling contiguity with a particular species through practices of recreation, and perhaps a way to sort of continue with a problematic past at times towards a troublesome and precarious future. But it might offer a way of sort of continuing. And I think maybe for the sake of time, because I do have a few sort of some work to contextualize the other images. Because I was also thinking yesterday. So these are spoonbills, but I was also sort of thinking about how the fact that these photos are nowadays sort of being digitally retouched and sort of made available for the public are also in some sense of telling the story of these birds, or continuing to tell the stories of these birds, and that sort of by combining it with a historical perspective, that might sort of offer, teach us about it as we move ahead. I also had this one with the common shelduck. On the left-hand side, you can see the glass plate negative, and on the right-hand side, you can see how these images were consequently sold and presented in Artis. And this one is a diorama that Steenhuisen made for Staatsbosbeheer, which is an organization that focuses on the protection of our woodland areas. And it's interesting because this is a photograph that Steenhuisen took when he was on Texel, but I think he partially used that to sort of create the background for this. So there's also sort of this, I don't know, sort of this recreation, which is sort of, a curiosity, a haptic curiosity in a sense. And that, I think, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on how we might sort of, find other ways of moving forward, or what other frayed edges we might find when looking at habitat dioramas or zoos as well. Because I was also thinking with Gail's presentation yesterday, for instance, how sort of these habitats are also artificially made, and in what sense you could then also talk about sort of a feeling of contiguity, or sort of a need to be closer to a different species. And well, I'm interested to hear your thoughts if you have any. I'll stop the sharing for now.
This is a really unacademic comment, but just it comes from an early morning place in the middle of the US. Looking at these dioramas, versus some of the images of zoos yesterday. I'm interested in thinking about the very different ways in which they're disturbing and depressing. For me, natural history museums especially, you're going to see something that tries to imitate what is alive, but it's so very manifestly dead. Whereas what you're looking at in a zoo, they are still alive and they're largely not in great positions. So some of your images just really reminded me of those two ways of reacting to these images of animals.
Yeah, it's a weird sort of contrast between sort of the habitat of animals on the one side, where it's sort of also this artificial, sort of the use of artificiality is employed in a different way. Yeah, and it's quite saddening on both ends. But it's, I don't know, I find it interesting to sort of to try to think, because I don't know, it's weird in some sense that a lot of these early ornithologists and sort of that there was or at least it seems that there was sort of a true interest or curiosity about the animal world or animal lives, but the way that they went about sort of doing that was really, I don't know, I think that might also be one of the discrepancies that come to the front when looking at images such as this. Yeah.
But I think one of the, sorry, I'm jumping the queue here, but isn't one of the things that you're looking at with the example of Steenhuisen and the Dutch wildlife photography and so on, is that you're looking for a different way of telling the story of that it's not only about sort of domination and the inadequacy of trying to capture life and so on. But I mean, I think one of what struck me about these images, and also the image of Steenhuisen himself in his workshop, and I was thinking also about Thera's presentation yesterday about, you know, all of these instructions for how to care for these bodies and whatever, right? That there is the combination of curiosity, which you mentioned a lot, and the care that is needed in order to preserve and taxidermy these specimens and so on. I mean, I think it's easy to think about it only in terms of violence and death and how depressing it all is and whatever. But I wonder if there isn't. I wonder what it would do to think about it also in terms of, you know, care in a more positive sense.
Yeah.
But
because that, that's indeed sort of the how we might look at this, like the histories that are also alongside these other ways that were unfortunately also there, but it might also offer us ways of moving forward or sort of how to deal with this. Yeah. I think Gail.
Thank you. I just think there's so much that we could say about those images, and I think they make a fantastic research object. So I think one of the things that I think is really striking is I guess the analytical, compositional kind of technical kind of questions that you've raised, you know, in terms of even things like you're saying, oh, they look messy, but then they're like these slices. They're like a bit of envelope that's been scientifically removed, you know, and kind of placed into these glass cabinets. So I think that it's very interesting to think about the way that the technical kind of aspects interact, I think, because you've got the photograph behind and the photograph being taken. And, you know, one of the things that I thought about when I looked at your images in the reader was that one of the things I often think about the diorama is the way that compression is used to create the effects. So you're actually using a kind of fake perspective, you know, kind of to, and particularly in that last one that you showed, it's quite obvious that you know, you've got this short kind of depth in which you're achieving a kind of sense of distance, which is a theatrical technique, part of the scenographic that Christina investigates. But you know, I think because you've got this kind of I mean, almost double story about the photo. You know, it's kind of a, I mean, I haven't worked it out, but I think there's something really interesting there for you, you know, about how that photographic because it's also the use of compression is, you know, a telephoto, quality of a telephoto lens, and that's kind of been talked about a lot in art history as well, in terms of the way that, say, someone like Jean-Louis David produces images that have a sort of mysterious monumentality about them. And that I'll leave the floor to the art historians here on that one, but it's kind of like plays back to the proximity distance theme, which has been coming up a lot. So I think it's really in that level as a sort of, you know, the sort of technical media, the kind of glass of the camera. And I don't know anything about the kind of camera. So I'd be interested to know, and also the way that the glass cabinets remind you of old-fashioned kind of glass slide frames as well. I kind of think some of those things could be really interesting in terms of rethinking the kind of, you know, technology kind of aspect of how we see things.
Yeah, because in a way it's like a framing upon a framing in a sense, like it's the framing of the camera, but then it's also once again framed by the diorama itself. And I think what the I can't remember the English word, but there were these huge cameras at the time, sort of these glass plate negative cameras, which were also very heavy to move and to sort of. So it's also, I don't know. I feel like it's also a very embodied way of taking the photograph in a sense. And
it is. And I think the thing that I would be confused about, and I'd love to hear your analysis of, and I don't expect you to do it now, but what is the spectator's position in all that toing and throwing? You know, you kind of have to, they're not actually obviously grounded in some sense because of these double takes. So I think that's a kind of interesting thing to sort of, you know, to back to what Harry is saying, like it's not always a story of domination, like in some ways the kind of the human viewer can kind of get sucked into their own machine and they're not really sure where they're looking from or at as well. But yeah, it's a great, really interesting, I think.
Thank you. Yeah, it's weird also because sort of the camera already points or already sort of shows the viewer how to look, but in actuality with a diorama, of course, you can enter it, or at least with this there, you can enter it from the side or from another different disposition, sort of, which might also be sort of methodological for how we can approach this subject or something. So, Johanna, I think you also.
I also have a more associative comment, because I just personally also do have a feeling of uncanniness or something that is weird, something that is strange, looking at something that wants to show something so alive and then in fact is so dead. And for me, it might not be a coincidence that taxidermy is something used in horror films to depict psychopaths, such as I don't know, Norman Bates, for example, in Bates Motel, or in Alfred Hitchcock movies. And yeah, I was wondering whether you have some remarks to that, like why is taxidermy such a good motive in horror films to show that uncanniness of, for example, serial killers?
But it's actually interesting because I do feel like or at least if you look sort of also the book by Rachel Poliquin, can't remember the name now, but at least she writes sort of this whole history on taxidermy, and there she also writes sort of that, I think around 1900, 1940 40, I think, there's sort of the shift from taxidermy as being something that was also used to that was used in economies of display of sort of trophies and stuff like that, where it sort of shifted indeed towards something that was done on the edges of society in some sense. That sort of this, but I'm not actually, I don't know enough about sort of the link between taxidermy and serial killers to comment properly on this, but I do feel like it has something to do with, it's taken up a different position in our society, and I think that might, but this is going out on a limb here, that might also be because photography also slowly sort of took over the job of taxidermy, of sort of preserving specific animals, but in a more clean way. And I think also what we talked about yesterday, that sort of at a certain point, sort of also the abattoirs are moved to the edge of the city, and sort of death is removed from society. And taxidermy is something that, but this is all speculation, so I have no grounding for this, but I can imagine that because of its close association with death, that might also be, and sort of trying to keep something in this liminal position in between, that might also be why it's sort of associated with the creep in a horror movie or something, or sort of with edge, with the phrase of society in a sense. I don't know if that answers your, or at least if that tells you something, but
yeah, it actually does, because the perception of taxidermy might have changed from the early 20th century to now, and so that seems to me quite plausible. Yeah,
I think that's maybe, I don't know who was first, Gil, or was that good?
Well, I don't know.
Oh, yeah.
Well, just a quick comment in connection with the film connection, and also in the Museum of Natural Science in Madrid. There's a couple of brothers that were working, creating also dioramas, and they, in connection with the dioramas, one author I know has pointed out that they work as films, because especially one that I will put the link in the chat, because it's again from birds, bee eaters, I think is the English name for them. And it's again, it's very, very similar with the one you put of the San Martins, and it has been described, and from the way you are supposed to look at it. You have to go around it, and there are very different scenes of the life of the birds. So all the life cycle is there, and it has been described in this way that it is like a nature film, because you are seeing the life cycle in all the different positions. So just in case this reference is of any use.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting. Yeah, because all these, or at least the photos I've shown, are quite static in us, or that they're sort of look. But I also think that the photo of the St. Martins is now taken from the front, but I think you can also walk to the back. Then you can see how they sort of nestle, sort of make nests. So I think indeed sort of the connection between a diorama as a film, or that it's sort of perhaps, well, I don't know. I need to look into that, sort of how the history of film and diorama, whether there is any connection between the two, or what might, how they might have contaminated each other in a sense. So yeah, thank you.
McRae is your man for this. Jonathan Crary's book, Techniques of the Observer. He writes a lot about how the panorama and the diorama as technologies in the 18th and 19th centuries sort of produced a certain kind of spectator who then would be able to understand what film even was. That it kind of it taught people to look in a particular way. I don't know if he talks about taxidermy. It's a long time since I read that book, but
Oh well. I'll check it out.
I'm just looking at the time, and if there are no further questions for Pauw, except I would have one comment, which is just that whenever I try and look at this Sand Martin photo, I think maybe it has something to do with these kind of watermarks that are superimposed on top of it, but I never have any idea what I'm looking at. And it takes me a very, very long time to even notice that there are any birds in this picture. And it's really interesting that he's painted out the surroundings to foreground what the picture is of. And I look at this and it's like it's like in Westworld. It doesn't look like anything to me. Anyway, just I thought I would throw that out there. But we should.
It removes all depth. It's weird.
Yeah, no, it's a very, very strange. Speaking of distance and proximity. Okay, so we have one more presenter. Calista, did you manage to sort out your headphone problems?
I did. I also, Pauw, if you need any more time, I think I audio bombed you a few minutes ago because I have the audio on my end has been interesting this morning. So I owe you a few minutes if there are more questions.
Yeah, if anyone has any questions, then
I am in a one-floor apartment that's basically a tin box, and when a little red squirrel runs across the roof, it sounds like a raccoon. So if at any point you can't hear me, just say so in the chat. I'm also going to put in the chat a slightly updated version of the poem I'm going to be talking about. Everyone has had so very impressive images, and they've been such a delight to look at that as a poetry person, I felt like I had to compensate in some small way. So if you want, that's a new copy. I'll share my screen briefly of the same PDF. Are you seeing Adobe Acrobat, or are you seeing the horror that is my inbox?
No, the horror that is Adobe Acrobat.
Okay, great. So Kari, thank you again for organizing this and for finagling time zones. I teach at a school with a bunch of engineers, so yesterday and this morning have been just a really nice change. I picked this poem mostly because I'm puzzled by it. I've been thinking about it as part of my current book project, which is at a very early stage. And I'm looking for recent English language poems that react to how humans affect other species, whether that's collective or individual actions, harmful actions, or ones where people are trying to help, encounters where the person knows what they're doing, or ones where they have no idea at the time. There are quite a few poems where a poet remembers damage they did as a kid, and later in life they come back to it. So a bunch of poems where the writer is struck by some aspect of how we intervene in other lives. As you might expect from many poets who write about animals in the last few decades, animals are sources of delight for them, but increasingly delight is entangled with disquiet. These writers can no longer see most animals as independent from humans. Very quick introduction to Lucy Brock Barreto herself. She was born in Pittsburgh in 1956, and she died just a couple weeks before this poem was published in 2018. She only published 4 books, pretty small, met with a lot of acclaim. She was drawn to animals and to animal rights from an early age. She became a vegetarian in her teens, I think around 1972. In that picture on the left, that's from, I think, her high school yearbook, so about the time she became interested in activism. And in one late interview, she remarked that if she could start over again, if she'd done something beyond being a poet, she would have worked in animal rights activism. That remark has stayed in my head as I've been reading Giraffe, mainly because there tends to be a gulf between mainstream poetry and anything that sounds remotely like activism. There's a preconception on the one hand that the causes of activism don't produce good lyric poems, and I can talk a bit about that more if people are interested later. And on the other hand, that lyric poetry is not a sensible genre for considerations of other lives or of moral problems. And Brock-Broido in general writes poems with a capital P. They tend to be very personal, sumptuous, exaggerated, linguistically striking, very, I don't mean this in a negative way, but institutional poems. So it interests me that she returns again and again to how we treat animals, and that's very explicitly in Giraffe. Are you all familiar with the incident that this poem is reacting to? I'm guessing this audience is. And I'm trying to see your faces to see if people are nodding or shaking their heads. Mostly familiar, okay. Marius, reticulated giraffe, born at the Copenhagen Zoo, killed because his genes were very prevalent in the zoo's stock of giraffes, and that was a source of massive public outcry, in part because a few other zoos offered to take him in, and because his body was subsequently dissected in front of school children and then fed to the lions. So Brock-Broido is taking up a subject that provoked outrage across the online world. She would have known that many people saw this grief and anger as naive or as sentimental, as members of the public who were just irrationally bothered by the fate of the one charismatic animal that they decided to care about that week. And in this poem, I think she leans into those strong feelings. So that might be one question to start with, what you make of the almost overt preciousness at moments in this poem. Lines like, his eyelashes as long as a hummingbird's tongue. Giraffe keeps reminding me of the fact that strongly felt moral stances are still at odds with ideas of what a lyric poem should be. And I put one quote from Yeats on this PDF below, where he says, we make out of the quarrel with others rhetoric, but out of the quarrel with ourselves, poetry. So that idea that a good poem should be nuanced and ambivalent and never try to persuade an audience, that idea still is in the air with people writing mainstream poems in the US. But poems about the treatment of animals can often feel more like protests. I think Giraffe does seem closer to a quarrel with others in some sense. She's writing from consternation. At moments, she's visibly sentimental. At other moments, extremely sardonic. And so I've been thinking about how you write a good poem on a subject that tends to produce strong emotion and moral outrage. I do think there are a lot of bad animal poems, ones that don't avoid glibness or stridency. But I find this poem so strange. I find it haunting. I raise eyebrows at bits of it still. I have a bunch of things I can go on about with it, but maybe firstly it would be, I'm curious to see if any of you have either questions about lines that didn't make sense to you or things that jumped out to you reading it this time. Margaret, I see a hand, thank you.
I think I'm definitely out of my comfort zone a little bit talking about poetry. So I'll preface that, but I think for me, I found that the end of the poem where she's describing the scene with the school children to be sort of really affecting, which was interesting because in the first half of the poem, I was kind of struggling with the way that she was
imagining this giraffe's lives, but it felt like really stuck in a human perspective. Like she's often talking about the giraffe's life the way it's defined relative to humans. And sort of on that point, something that struck out to me was where she mentions the giraffes humming, and she says, no one knows how this happened. And I was kind of like, well, if we're thinking about a giraffe's perspective, like the giraffe does know. So I was kind of like getting a little bit frustrated by this sort of the humanness of the poem. But then I don't know why I was sort of more okay with it or found it more affecting when we got to the scene with the school children. But that was sort of a place where I felt tension in the poem, was imagining the giraffe's life, but it felt like always sort of relative to humans.
Yeah, I think, I mean, right from the start, when Brooke Broido, the giraffe gets about a phrase, and then suddenly it's all about Cleopatra and about Cleopatra's kind of kitschy eye makeup, and just so aggressively, it foregrounds what's very, very exotic and very, very pretty. I think one way for me of trying to explain those moments is to think about the scope of her anger. So it's she names the vet, she names the zoo director, and there's something as if she wants to embed these particular people who did this in the poem. But she doesn't just name them. She addresses the draw of the giraffe. It's sort of as an object with such aesthetic appeal. And how she is clearly, she's drawn again and again to his beautiful eyes and his eyelashes and his tail that could curve like a goat's or a little dog's tail, and his fetlocks. And she spends so much time picturing him or thinking of him as beautiful that in a way, I don't know if it would be fair to say she makes herself complicit, but she depicts herself as involved in making this creature exoticized. And so she's drawn in by the same qualities that make the giraffe a trophy, or that make humans again and again feel as if, oh, we're going to bring this giraffe 1,000 miles away from its home, or we're going to protect this giraffe, but we're not going to protect this particular subspecies because we don't need to. So in a way, it extends the poem from being a quarrel with others to, in a way, being a quarrel about herself, to use that phrase from Yeats, or at least there's a degree of self-examination in there. I'd be curious to hear from others about the school children too, because Margaret, I like that bit a lot, but I'm not sure I'm making sense of it in my head. I see.
Sorry, because I don't have I'm on a different computer. It doesn't have a hand to raise. I can only applaud. I can't raise my hand. So, but I've been thinking throughout all of these three presentations, and this is maybe just more of a rambling comment than a clear question. But what's been striking for me is the relationship between the general and the particular, and how they play out in these different examples. And what I've just read the poem, recently. I don't know her work at all. And I was very struck by what is happening in the poem. I'm almost less interested in her sentiment, but the way in which she uses the very particular detail in relation to the general question of the giraffe. Like she's anchoring him or her in particular contexts and historical moments as a way of setting this up against how it's seen in the context of the zoo as a member of the species, like a representative of the species, versus as an individual creature in particular interactions with humans at various historical moments in which he's seen as something different. Like there are particularities in all of those things that she describes. being fed rose petals. And I almost want to read it as it's not about realism, as it were, that all of those, what they have in common is that they're speculative. And she really draws attention to that by saying, like, do you not believe me? I can't remember what did she say exactly? Something about, do you find my story pleasing? Do you think I've imagined this? So, and obviously, yes, she has, but she's also sort of drawing attention to, I don't know, this sort of play between, the way in which these particular details are imaginary versus the kind of cold gaze of the science who say, you are only a species, we don't need you. So, and I mean, I was thinking about it in relation to Pauw's talk as well. In terms of this relationship between background and foreground, like what is in the foreground, I was really interested in Gail's points about the sort of technical aspects, which I don't know a lot about, but like in that diorama, what is the background and what is the foreground? What is supposed to be what we look at? How are we being invited to look at nature? Are we looking at the birds as species? Are we looking at them as particular, are they examples of something else? You know, what is the real in there? And what do these funny little details do that the photographer or the taxidermist adds? How do those details disturb this idea of animal as representative of species? And maybe also for the hippopotamus as well. I mean, how does that engraving invite a kind of consideration of the relationship between background and foreground? And how do these funny realist details in that engraving also complicate the idea of animal as representative of species? Right, sorry, a bit of a rambling comment there.
No, I am here for rambling comments. And that's a helpful one. I think especially I realized this morning I wasn't focused all that much on zoos in looking at this poem. But I think one way that your comment does link this poem to zoos is through the trajectory of those details. So the first 2/3 of this poem, we have a couple giraffes in the wild, but they're mostly giraffes taken to Europe. And I think you could read all of those little vignettes one of two ways, or maybe both ways. One is seeing them all as a contrast to the Copenhagen incident. So each of these early giraffes, they're basically worshipped. Ruler after ruler goes after these giraffes because they find them curious or pleasing or in some way incredible. The other reading of all of these images of historical giraffes would be to see them as of a piece with what was done in Copenhagen. Every single giraffe taken away from their normal habitat and brought to Europe again and again. So that's not really an answer to your question about how we make sense of these details, but I do find myself sort of fluctuating between how to read Brooke-Rhoda's tone in some of these moments, just how sarcastic or not sarcastic it is. I think I see hands from Gail and then Kari and Andrew.
I mean, I'm not an expert on poetry by any means, but I didn't really like the poem. And I felt like I'd, sort of started in Homer and ended up on, Instagram or something. And it was kind of like the stories that she's telling, for me, they didn't really work on that kind of affective level that I think the best animal poetry, I've read, the stuff that I find really affecting. Somehow, when we're all studying animal kind of histories and you read all those little vignettes, and it seemed like we were just, and obviously ignore me, but it seemed like we were, you know, just being given a kind of collection of those little vignettes, and they're kind of been knitted together. And I'm a bit lost into what her purpose really is. But I think you just explained what it is. Really, it's that kind of contrast in value. But I couldn't help comparing it with a poem that I did get a bit obsessed with, which was Baudelaire's The Swan. Do you know that poem? Yeah, which is sort of like a little bit similar in the sense that, you know, he's talking about, you know, Homeric kind of imagery and epic poetry kind of images, but then he kind of describes this swan he's seen on the dusty streets of Paris in great kind of, you know, and a kind of bad situation, and I found that poem particularly moving. I kind of wonder how you think that kind of compares with the giraffe poem. Yeah, so just.
So I don't trust me. I don't trust myself to talk about the swan poem now, in part because I'm going to confuse it with the albatross poem, which I just, as a side note, there's a Paul Muldoon poem that takes in the albatross poem where the sailors drag the albatross down onto the ship, and you see how clumsily he's forced to walk when he's no longer at his ease in the air. Muldoon takes the Baudelaire albatross poem and then takes recent articles about what's happening to albatross families because they see cigarette lighters and think that they're little translucent squid. Yeah. And he sort of brings these two both horrifying things together in a poem that I guess I am recommending it to you, even though it's awful in a way. I think with Brock-Broido, it's such a maximalist poem. There are so many allusions, and then amid the allusions, you have these weird interrupting questions where this first person intrudes and says, do you find me curious as well? Or do you find my story pleasing too? I can very much see how to some readers, if you think of that question asker as being the poet, you can say, well, what do I particularly care about your story right now? The giraffe is my focus. So all that is by way of saying, I think I can see your reaction. And I guess with those questions, I'm still trying to figure out how to read them because they don't all fit from the same, as being directed to the same person or maybe even from the same person. But I think of her as addressing readers in the present or in the future who are going to write her off as sentimental or as quaint, those who would dismiss a woman who is upset about one single giraffe's death. Yeah. But it's a poem that is so sort of centrifugal and just like stretched in so many directions that the swan poem is a good contrast. And also, I'm seeing a lot of comments in the chat, for which thank you, and I'm going to take them in gradually. Kari, I think I see your hand.
Yeah, I have. Well, I was kind of going to, I think, well, I'm basically going to repeat what Louise and Gail just said. Maybe. I wasn't crazy about the poem either. I think that what you're saying about it makes me want to look at it again. But I was really struck by how absent Marius is from the poem, I think. And there's a kind of, right, Matt made a similar comment in the chat that it's, right, in another life he was Caesar's pet. So this is a kind of, I'm reminded of Schopenhauer, kind of, you know, the individual giraffe may perish, but the idea of the giraffe is eternal. And so there is this kind of every giraffe is the giraffe. And I don't know the poet, and I don't know enough about her sort of poetics or her ideas about things to be able to say. So maybe you could fill us in here a little bit, but I wonder to what extent this is a kind of a commentary on the, I don't know, the capture and proliferation of non-human animals, not just in scientific discourse, but also in the cultural imagination, and that you go to the zoo and you see a representation of the giraffe as a species, and when you see that, you also, or she sees then Marius as a representative of the kind of the cultural history of the giraffe, where every giraffe in history is this giraffe. And I'm just curious how to read that, whether this is another erasure of Marius, a failed attempt to get at the actual individual that she's trying to talk about, or if this is more of a I don't know, more of a meta commentary, or more sort of I don't want to say ironic, but you know what I mean, more of a kind of a deliberate discrepancy, maybe.
I think the way that she pivots to him in the last third, and that he is given so little space, it's certainly deliberate in some sense. I had a thought and it went flying. She tries briefly to imagine the last thoughts that go through his head, trying to picture that gray cobbled steeple in the middle distance of a dome, or thinking back to this impossible life that I guess she seems to imagine he could somehow sense where he should have been able to grow up. But then again, it goes so immediately outwards to, I guess, what the vet would have seen, which is how the sun would have cast the shadows of his eyelashes into these long pink shadows on his face. There really is not much in there about this particular giraffe. So why that's given so little space. Brockburdo does have a number of poems where she is drawn to imagining what it would be like to be a specific animal. A rabbit who's been left in a cage somewhere in, I think, France. What it's like to be a particular horse, and also to have the joy of being a particular horse, doing what a horse does well. She has a lot of poems with moments of outrage at especially treatment in the US of factory farm animals, or animals that are slaughtered by the shackle and hoist method. So it is something where she's thinking about it over each of these books, and is disturbed by it. But I'd say Giraffe is actually the poem where she talks about one animal's treatment and one incident for the most extended amount of time. Often the other animals are mixed in, often with thinking about the treatment of humans. She was also very concerned about the death penalty, in part because of the knowledge that you just have the one life and that's it. So in a way, when she keeps saying in Giraffe, in another life, that reminds me of the 2 years this giraffe had, that was actually it. He didn't have any of these others. That got into blurting out, but thank you for the question.
Okay, I just to follow up before, I mean, there were a couple of more hands, but I'm also thinking about, I guess what I was trying to say, thinking back to Louise's talk yesterday, is that if the poem is an enclosure for Marius here, then once he is enclosed in the poem, then he also becomes a representative of the species, but the species as represented in cultural history, I guess. I think was what I was trying to say. But I see that Gail and Andrew have their hands up.
Gail, is that an artifact, or did you have more? Okay. Calista, thank you so much for sharing this. As an English prof, I'm stoked to do a close read with all you guys. There's a Canadian writer, Wei-Sin Choi, who died recently, who I was at an event with him, and he was asked by the audience this very question about activism in writing and literature, and he's a great novelist. He writes poetry too, but it doesn't publish. And he said, he just laughed at the question of sort of, could a writer ever be an activist? And he laughed, and with his tongue firmly in his cheek, he said, writing a book is the most active thing you can do. And we all laughed, and then we got the second joke in there, and we all laughed again. And this is something I've been thinking a lot about constantly, writing nonfiction about animals. But I think it's a really interesting question to ask about poetry as well. My sense with this poem is that there's just a gigantic missed opportunity with it. And I feel like so often when a writer of any to be active in their work, to try to say something about what's wrong, so often we take the moment that just happened and then we go backwards and we go into history and we show through our work all the things we've done, right? We go back into cultural history and we look at all the things we've done that have led us to this moment. And I've always felt with Marius, and I'm planning to do a chapter on Marius as well, so he's on my mind. What I've always felt with Marius is that he has never been representative of the giraffe for me. And he's also not even been representative of the thing I stuck in the chat there about Kikok Lee and what they think about this. Marius has always been representative for me of as a member of the species of zoo animal, of the 500 animals every year in the EU that are euthanized at zoos. That to me is the species to which Marius belongs. And I've always felt, with the way that we talk about this in the culture, but also the way this poem talks about Marius, is instead of showing us all the things that we have done, I kind of wish the poem showed us all the things we are doing right now. And I feel like there was a way to make this poem a really powerful piece of activism by staying in the moment, because we can't get away from it like we can with all of this historical stuff. If we suddenly start talking about all the animals that are euthanized at zoos for this very reason throughout the world. So that's what I took from the poem. I was struck that
we lost you there.
Maybe it's 5,000. Maybe it's 5,000. I kind of pulled that out of my memory.
Andrew, can you hear me? I'm not sure if it's my Wi-Fi or there's a little bit of a lag.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think to your point about a poem as being able to document what is happening right now, one poem that I think does that well is Alice Fulton's poems about the slaughtering of pigs. And right now I'm blanking on the title, but I can probably put it into the chat later. I think it might be in Some Cool. But it seems to me a poem that's ambitious in the way you're describing. I think the one place I'd point to in Brock Breuta's Giraffe that is looking at what we're still doing and also what we're doing into the future is at the end with the school children. The tone of these lines is very strange to me, but one thing that strikes me is just how in every sense passive the children are made. Like grammatically, they're wound and down, they're bound in bright wool scarves. They're brought in and their reactions are kind of obscured. They're being taught that this is what science is like. This is how you protect animals. And they don't register much at the time except curiosity. We just really can't see what their reaction is, but then later at night, there's this sense of trouble that's even reflected in the weather, that something is wrong with this scene. So I think if I write about this poem, or if I try to sell animal studies people on this poem, I think that is a place I'd want to think more about what Brock-Broido is saying in those last images of the dissection and the kids, and later that same night.
Yeah, I totally hear you. You're right to direct me to that ending, and that larger question of education has always also felt like a completely separate issue here, and I found it really interesting that it's kind of appended to the end of it, and it's where we get left, but there's a collection of poetry just in that moment with the kids.
Yeah, I mean, I think Brock-Broido is thinking about this one individual whom we can imagine as having an inner life and whom we can care about, versus so it's this, the typical animal rights versus conservationist debate. We have to step in and protect these species, and we only have so many resources, and here's how we can do that. So I think this poem is one of the ones where that debate is pretty explicit to me. I haven't, Brock-Broido's archive is at Columbia, but if you're not a Columbia researcher, you cannot get in there to see what she read or her notes at this point yet. But at some point I'd like to go see how extensively she was reading literature of the past 20 years about conservation and about animal rights.
I mean, I think that one of the interesting questions that is raised for me is like, what does it mean to be an advocate of nature? Or in this case, an advocate of animals. Because, and this is not something which stays still, because I was thinking back to the Pauw's example of the photographs on the taxidermied animals, and Carl Akeley's project to go to Africa and shoot all these animals and bring them back and taxidermy them and put them up in his Hall of Mammals. And Haraway talks about the fact that he saw himself as an advocate for nature. This was his project. He was protecting, he was doing this for the sake of nature. And to us now, it seems extraordinary that he would go off and slaughter all these animals, and all in the name of conservation. But I think it's dangerous for us to think we know what it means to be an advocate of nature. It's such a complicated question, and it's so historically bound. I think there's a very particular way in which we nowadays see ourselves as different from those in the past who understood their role in relation to nature differently. So I think it's complex to think about what people do and whether there's only one way in which you can do it. I don't know really what I'm saying, but yeah.
Yeah, when I read poems from the mid-century that speak to how we treat animals, a lot of them I don't think have aged that well. I won't name poets here, but yeah, I would just agree with what you said.
Okay, perhaps that's a good place to leave it. It's 2:30, well, 2:30 where I am, which means that according to the official plan, we are bang on time for a break of 15 minutes. I propose we try and stick to the schedule. So thank you to our three presenters. Big round of virtual applause. And I'll see you all back here in 15 minutes for the second round.
Thank you very much.